This is CNN, a service of Turner Broadcasting System.
Good morning, I'm Susan Rook, and here are some of the stories we're following on CNN. The controversial Iranian arms deal reportedly grew out of a long-standing covert operation run by Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. That's according to today's New York Times. The newspaper says the operation was established at least 4 years ago to conduct secret foreign policy initiatives. The Times says the program, called Project Democracy, began as a covert side of an otherwise well-publicized initiative under the same name. The paper says Project Democracy maintained its own communication system, secret envoys, leased ships, airplanes, and bank accounts. The program operated outside the purview of Congress. Britain has reportedly asked Syria for help in finding Anglican envoy Terry Waite. Waite dropped out of sight in Lebanon more than 3 weeks ago while negotiating the release of foreign hostages, and is feared to be held hostage himself. The Observer, a British newspaper, reported today that London had agreed to upgrade diplomatic ties with Syria in return for help in gaining Waite's release. Britain broke off relations with Syria last October after a Jordanian with suspected Syrian ties was convicted in London of trying to blow up an Israeli airliner. But a Foreign Office spokesman denies making any deal. A car bomb exploded today in a hospital parking lot in a central Israeli town. Police suspect the bomb was planted by Palestinian guerrillas. There are still no reports of any casualties, and the Israeli military is censoring reports on the blast. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir is beginning a 10-day visit to the U.S. tomorrow. As CNN's Mike Greenspan reports, Shamir says he will explain his opposition to an international peace conference in the Middle East.
This will be the first visit of an Israeli leader since the Iran arms affair surfaced last November. Prime Minister Shamir is expected to argue against what he perceives as America's sense of guilt over the arms shipments. He'll try to talk President Reagan out of selling weapons to Arab countries upset by Washington's links with Tehran. Shamir is likely to face tough questioning from Congress over Israel's role in the Iran arms affair and his own refusal to allow U.S. investigators to question Israeli officials involved in it. Shamir's visit comes barely a week after rumors of U.S.-Israeli cooperation to end the hostage crisis in Lebanon. The two sides will likely consider further options for combating terrorism. Shamir leaves a government crisis behind him in Israel, where the Labor and Likud parties are sharply split over the future of the Middle East peace process.
If an international form will lead to direct negotiations and unfold. At this stage, we don't think it could serve the purpose of peace. It will be more a stage for propaganda.
Shamir will seek President Reagan's support for his own views. In a format similar to Camp David, he'll propose that Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and the United States sit together to negotiate. The Iran arms affair has shattered illusions in both countries about their special relationship. During his 10-day visit, Shamir will do his best to plaster over the cracks. Mike Greenspan, CNN, Jerusalem.
The Shiite Amal militia claims it has ended a siege of a Palestinian refugee camp in southern Lebanon. Amal says the camp's 30,000 residents will be free to come and go each day between 7 a.m. and 2 p.m. to shop for food and other supplies. Meanwhile, a United Nations convoy carrying food and medicine has been allowed into another Palestinian refugee camp in Beirut. Police say the convoy, supervised by Iranian and Syrian officials, entered the camp at 1 a.m., leaving flour, powdered milk, and bandages. Many of the 35,000 residents of the camp are reportedly near starvation.
Dentist always remembered me because of my tartar. He would have to spend hours scraping. And when he said tartar control crest, of course I went with it.
To remove ugly... This is CNN, a service of Turner Broadcasting System.
heard this morning that the governments of Syria and Iran are both working to secure the release of hostage negotiator Terry Waite, missing for nearly a month.
This is Daybreak Sunday on CNN for February 15th, 1987, with Patrick Greenlaw in Atlanta.
Good morning. Here's the latest. Britain has reportedly stepped up diplomatic relations with Syria in an effort to get Anglican envoy Terry Waite out of Lebanon. Waite disappeared January 20th while trying to gain the release of foreign hostages and is feared to have been taken captive. The British Observer newspaper reported that Britain has agreed to upgrade relations with Syria after cutting off ties last October in return for help in freeing Waite. But a British government spokesman denies making such a deal. The newspaper also reported that both Syria and Iran are negotiating for Waite's release. It says Syria wants credit for freeing Waite, and Iran wants to use Waite as a bargaining chip for more U.S. arms. A pro-Iranian group has released another photo of American hostage Terry Anderson and denied any part in kidnapping a former advisor to the Lebanese president last week. The Islamic Jihad sent the photo with a statement denying responsibility for the politician's abduction to a Western news agency yesterday. Meanwhile, another extremist group holding 4 university professors hostage has called off its offer to swap them for 400 Arabs held by Israel. CNN's Ben McNitt has more.
A statement delivered to Beirut newspapers from the kidnappers, Islamic Jihad for the Liberation of Palestine, says they will not negotiate for the release of their 4 hostages. The group says its demand to swap the hostages, including 3 Americans, for 400 Israeli-held prisoners is suspended. The United States was blamed for failing to pressure Israel into the swap. Here in Damascus, Nabi Berri, head of the Lebanese Shiite Amal militia, says he is not discouraged by the kidnappers' latest communique. Berri is working on a 3-way swap, trading on Israeli airmen Amal holds for the 400 prisoners if the kidnappers first release their hostages. Berri says he will ask the Red Cross within the next 10 days to open negotiations with Israel on the airman prisoners exchange. But for the moment, the Amal leader is more concerned with events at the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. In the early morning, Berri allowed a United Nations relief team through Amal's siege ring around the Burj al-Barajna camp to distribute 17 tons of flour and powdered milk. In 3 months of fighting, Amal, backed by Syria, has surrounded the camps to choke off an attempt by PLO leader Yasser Arafat to reestablish guerrilla bases there. In Burj al-Barajna, near starvation has reportedly reduced the refugees, some of whom have fled to other camps, to eating dogs, rats, and donkeys. On Friday, a UN relief convoy was halted when unknown gunmen opened fire. An Iranian who was escorting the supplies was killed. In Tunis, Arafat called on the UN to relieve the famine in the Palestinian shantytowns.
We have the right to live as human beings. We want to live in peace in our homelands. I'm not facing death.
With the kidnappers refusing negotiations and very preoccupied with the camps war, whatever slim chance existed for the hostages' early release has all but evaporated. Ben McNitt, CNN, Damascus.
In the central Israeli town of Kfar Saba, a car bomb exploded outside a large hospital today. Police say the man who placed the car bomb was killed. 2 men described by police as non-Israelis were wounded. Police suspect Palestinian terrorists were behind the attack and are searching for suspects. Although bombs are sometimes planted on Israeli buses and at bus stops, car bomb attempts are fairly rare in Israel. The New York Times reports this morning that a covert program called Project Democracy was the basis for secret U.S. contacts with Iran and the Nicaraguan rebels. The Times, citing unidentified government officials, says Project Democracy was set up 4 years ago in the White House to conduct covert foreign policy actions. The Times says the program, under the supervision of former National Security Council staffer Oliver North, acted without the oversight of Congress. The Times says Project Democracy was the secret arm of a public foreign aid group that used to have the same name. 4 Central American presidents will meet today in Costa Rica to consider what's being called a last chance peace initiative. The plan proposed by Costa Rican President Oscar Arias calls for the U.S. and the Soviet Union to end military aid to the region. The presidents of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala were invited to take part in today's talks, but Nicaragua was excluded. Connecticut Senator Christopher Dodd, who arrived in Costa Rica for his second tour of the region, says the peace plan may be the last chance for peace in Central America. About 2,000 people marched to the Alabama Capitol yesterday, calling on officials to increase black representation on legislative committees. Those who joined the 3-mile trek are angry over what they say is a reduction of black assignments on key committees. In addition, they argue Republican Governor Guy Hunt is keeping blacks down by only appointing one black to his cabinet. Several civil rights leaders took part in a rally at the Capitol, including the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He told the crowd it's time blacks had their share of power in the Alabama State House.
If we play football together, if in war we fight and die together, if we pay taxes together, then when you appoint committees, we want our share of chairmanships, our share of justice together.
The number of blacks in the new legislature has not changed since the last session, but new presiding officers in the House and Senate have changed the pattern of committee assignments. War toys were burned in Santa Monica, California yesterday as peace activists chanted their opposition to war. Actress Drew Barrymore lit the flames for the symbolic public meltdown of toys said to promote war. Organizers say the event was held on Valentine's Day to emphasize love, not war. Fuel for the blaze included the traditional war toys such as G.I. Joe and newer high-tech weapons such as laser tag. Strategists for peace are the focus of an international anti-nuclear forum being held in Moscow. The 3-day meeting got underway yesterday with Nobel Peace Prize winner Andrei Sakharov as a keynote speaker. The Soviet news agency TASS said Sakharov called for a drastic reduction in nuclear arms. TASS says Sakharov also pushed for the release of imprisoned Soviet dissidents. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev is due to address the conference tomorrow. The speech by Gorbachev may reflect a significant change in Soviet attitude toward arms control. CNN's Ralph Begleiter has that story.
American arms control experts say the Soviets may be about to make a significant move in the long-playing chess game of nuclear arms negotiations. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev will speak Monday morning to a large group of scientists, educators, business people, and cultural figures who were invited to Moscow from around the world for a conference on world peace. Soviet ambassador to Washington Yuri Dubinin had high-level meetings at the State Department this week and at the White House with National Security Advisor Frank Carlucci. A week ago, sources say, Chief Soviet arms control negotiator Yuri Vorontsov left Geneva abruptly, telling his American counterpart, Max Kampelman, that he had to return to Moscow to prepare for Gorbachev's speech. All this has American officials and other experts thinking Gorbachev may make a new arms proposal, which could move the Geneva talks toward an agreement. Sources close to the negotiations say the Soviets appear to be buckling down to reach an agreement. It's getting down to brass tacks, says one official. We're expecting progress. And there's an important shift of emphasis now from medium-range missiles to long-range or strategic missiles. Sources say the Soviets are now showing interest in achieving the 50% cut in long-range missiles, which President Reagan and Gorbachev spoke of in Iceland. The shift away from the medium-range missile issue may reflect Europe's sudden fear after the Iceland summit of being stripped of those weapons. Gorbachev and Reagan both know they can make progress on strategic missiles without frightening the NATO allies.
Some U.S. officials are not as optimistic, but others are beginning to think Gorbachev has decided to go for an arms control deal with Washington. Says one official, we're closer to agreement across the board than ever before. We're moving. Ralph Begleiter, CNN at the State Department.
Just ahead on Daybreak Sunday, a look at your weekend weather and sports, and a look at a 4-year-old boy casting his own spell.
How do you spell abbreviate?
A-B-B-I-V-I-T.
Hello, I'm... This is CNN, a service of Turner Broadcasting System.
Demonstrations in Moscow last week on behalf of jailed refusnik Joseph Begun appear to have paid off. Begun reportedly has been released from jail. Hello, I'm Patrick Greenlaw in Atlanta. Here's the latest. A jailed Jewish activist, the focus of sometimes violent protests in Moscow last week, may be a free man today. Joseph Begun's release was announced by a Soviet official today speaking on CBS. For more on the story, CNN's Moscow bureau chief Peter Arnett is with us on the phone right now. Peter, what's the latest?
Yes, well, Patrick, Georgy Abrasov, he's a member of the Soviet Central Committee. He did announce that Begun had been released. He said, I've made a telephone call. This case is resolved. He is free now. I telephoned Mrs. Ina Begun just a few minutes ago. She said she had no information on it. She asked if he's been released, where is he? However, sometimes the wives are the last to know. Now, this case was the focus of street demonstrations all last week. For 5 days, Mrs. Baygun, her son Boris, and friends were in downtown Moscow protesting his imprisonment. Towards the end of the week, the demonstrations did become violent. Our television equipment was broken. Others were hurt. Some newsmen were briefly arrested. Baygun is serving a 7-year sentence for anti-Soviet agitation. He's in his early 60s. He is an activist, and his friends and family want him home, and it looks like, on the basis of the announcement today, that he will be home soon, Patrick.
Peter, how much emphasis can we put on those demonstrations that you were a part of, and certainly your colleagues being roughed up by Soviet plainclothes police officers? Do you think that that had any effect in precipitating the release today?
I think they did. Dr. Abadov says they didn't, that they delayed his release. However, a Foreign Ministry spokesman said midweek that Baygun was not released along with about 140 others because he refused to ask for a pardon. And we think, and I'm pretty sure, that the protest demonstrations and the international reaction had a lot to do with his being freed today.
Okay, Peter Arnett reporting live from Moscow, and of course we'll have further details on this story as soon as they become available. The New York Times reports this morning that a 4-year covert program run by former White House aide Oliver North was the basis for secret U.S. contacts with Iran and the Nicaraguan rebels. CNN's Jeff Offgang has the details.
It was called Project Democracy, and it was inspired by President Reagan's speech to Britain's Parliament in 1982. Mr. Reagan called for a worldwide effort to cultivate what he called the flower of democracy.
For the sake of peace and justice, let us move toward a world in which all people are at last free to determine their own destiny. Thank you.
Public and private aid would be collected for democratic institutions such as labor unions and political parties in countries where freedoms were threatened. But the New York Times now reports that the democracy program had a secret side that was run from the White House basement. The Times based its account on interviews with many present and former government officials. In January 1983, Mr. Reagan reportedly ordered the National Security Council to coordinate government efforts for Project Democracy. Later that year, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane put the project in the hands of his aide, Oliver North. Officials say the project grew out of concern that the State Department wasn't strongly enough behind the administration's anti-communist policies. The Times says Project Democracy grew into a rival apparatus with its own communications, transport, secret envoys, and bank accounts. And when Congress banned military aid to the Nicaraguan Contras in 1984, the democracy apparatus reportedly stepped in. Congressional investigators say it kept the Contras in business with money, equipment, and other aid. And 2 years later, it reportedly was used to ship arms to Iran. Also last year, a Project Democracy ship reportedly was used in a failed effort to deliver a $1 million ransom donated by billionaire H. Ross Perot for American hostages in Lebanon. Officials say the Tower Commission, now investigating the National Security Council, has been unable to prove that President Reagan expressly approved covert actions under Project Democracy. The Times says those actions were so secret, even some of North's own colleagues were left in the dark. Jeff Offgang, CNN, reporting.
A Lebanese Muslim leader is making a new plea on behalf of missing hostage negotiator Terry Wade. Jewish Chief Wally Jumblatt is asking the pro-Iranian group Hezbollah to free Wade if they are in fact holding him. The Shiite organization denies any involvement in Wade's disappearance January 20th in Beirut. Jumblatt's militia had been responsible for Wade's safety. Jumblatt has also received a message from the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, asking for his continued help in locating the Church of England envoy. But the Foreign Office is denying a London Observer newspaper report that Britain is improving relations with Syria as part of a deal to win Syria's help in freeing Wade. The two countries broke diplomatic ties last year. Syria and Iran are both believed to have strong links to the various kidnapping groups in Beirut. Unidentified kidnappers apparently have released a former Lebanese presidential aide in Beirut this morning. Official sources tell Western news agencies that Juan Obeid was turned over to the Lebanese authorities. His release may be part of a swap for Lebanese hostages held by different warring factions. The terrorist group Islamic Jihad denied in a statement yesterday that it had anything to do with Obeid's kidnapping. The statement was accompanied by a photo of Terry Anderson, one of the 2 Americans the Islamic Jihad claims to be holding. And as tensions continue to rise over kidnappings in Lebanon, the U.S. has raised its level of military cooperation with Israel.
Heavy thunderstorms, even a possibility of a few tornadoes in Louisiana and Mississippi. We'll highlight that in just a few moments.
This is CNN, a service of Turner Broadcasting System.
A week of demonstrations, sometimes violent, has been followed by the release of a dissident in Moscow. Moscow says the release would have occurred sooner if those demonstrations had never taken place. Hello, I'm Steve Shatz, and welcome to Newsday Sunday here on CNN. A prominent Jewish dissident jailed in the Soviet Union is apparently free now. Word came from a top Soviet official speaking on a CBS News program today that Joseph Begun had been freed. His release follows a week of protests in Moscow on his behalf. Some of those rallies were violently disrupted by Soviet plainclothes policemen. Georgy Arbatov, a member of the Soviet Central Committee, said the Jewish activist would have been released earlier if those protests had not occurred.
You know, Mr. Begun, because of whom all the demonstrations started, his case was in the process of, reassessment. And he would have been free several days ago. Wouldn't it be for this demonstration? He is free now, I can tell you. Well, the resolution, yes.
Begun, a Hebrew teacher, was serving a 7-year sentence for anti-Soviet activity. His wife, who helped organize last week's protest, said she has not yet received word of his release. The New York Times reports today that a covert program called Project Democracy was the basis for secret U.S. contacts with Iran and with Nicaraguan rebels. The newspaper says the program was set up in the White House 4 years ago to conduct covert foreign policy activities. The Times says the program
This is CNN, a service of Turner Broadcasting System.
A week of demonstrations in the Soviet Union ends with the release of a political prisoner, but a Soviet official says those same demonstrations may have delayed the release of that dissident. Hello, I'm David French in Washington.
And I'm Rick Moore in Atlanta. The Soviet dissident is Joseph Begun, jailed since 19...